The bullet tore through Beatrice Kane's shoulder just as she reached for the reins of her spooked mare, and the impact sent her stumbling backward into the dusty street of Jackson, Wyoming. But her first thought was not for herself, but for the chestnut gelding beside her that had taken a graze to its flank. The year was 1882, and the bank robbery had erupted without warning on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September. 3 masked men had burst from the Jackson First National with guns blazing and canvas bags heavy with stolen money. And in the chaos that followed, innocent bystanders and their animals had paid the price for the outlaws' greed. Beatrice's vision swam as she pressed her left hand against her bleeding shoulder, but she forced herself to focus on the terrified horse beside her. The gelding belonged to someone else, a stranger, but that didn't matter. The animal was injured and frightened, its eyes rolling white with panic as it tried to bolt despite the wound that streaked crimson down its dark hide. She grabbed the trailing reins with her good hand and spoke in a low, soothing voice that cut through the surrounding gunfire and shouting. "Easy now, easy boy," she murmured, her own pain temporarily forgotten as she ran her fingers along the horse's neck. The gelding trembled but responded to her touch, its breathing rapid but no longer quite so frantic. Blood soaked through Beatrice's cotton blouse, spreading in a dark stain that she ignored as she examined the horse's injury. The bullet had carved a shallow furrow across the animal's hindquarter, painful but not life-threatening if properly tended. Ethan Irving watched from where he had taken cover behind a water trough, his revolver drawn and forgotten in his hand as he stared at the woman in the middle of the street. He had been reaching for his horse when the shooting started, had seen the animal bolt and feared it lost in the pandemonium. Now this stranger, this woman with auburn hair escaping its pins and blood streaming down her arm, was calming his gelding with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence erupting around them. The sheriff and his deputies had engaged the robbers in a fierce exchange of gunfire, and bullets still whined through the air like angry hornets. Ethan knew he should help, should add his gun to the fight, but he found himself transfixed by the sight of this woman who cared more for an injured horse than her own obvious wound. She was already pulling a bandana from her skirt pocket, wrapping it around the gelding's flank with practiced movements despite the way her hands shook. "Madam, you need to take cover," Ethan called out, finally finding his voice as he holstered his weapon and moved toward her in a low crouch. The shooting was moving down the street as the outlaws tried to fight their way to their own horses, but stray bullets could still find their mark. Beatrice barely glanced at him as she tied off the makeshift bandage on the horse. "He needs tending," she said simply, her voice steady despite the pallor of her face. "The wound needs to be cleaned and properly dressed or it could turn septic." "You have been shot," Ethan said incredulously as he reached her side, his dark eyes taking in the extent of her injury with growing alarm. The bullet had entered the fleshy part of her shoulder, and while it did not appear to have struck bone or major vessels, she was losing blood at an alarming rate. "I know," Beatrice replied, finally meeting his gaze with eyes the color of storm clouds, "but I can wait. Your horse cannot understand what has happened to him, and he is too frightened to wait patiently while I see to myself first." Something in Ethan's chest constricted at those words. At the matter-of-fact way she prioritized an animal's distress over her own pain. He had spent his 32 years around cowboys and ranchers, people who valued good horseflesh and treated their animals well, but he had never met anyone quite like this. The woman swayed slightly on her feet, and he reached out instinctively to steady her with a hand on her uninjured arm. "At least let me help you sit down," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You can talk me through what needs doing for the horse, but you need to get off your feet before you fall down." The shooting had stopped now, and townspeople were emerging from their hiding places to survey the damage. One of the robbers lay dead in the street, while the other two had been captured by the sheriff's men. Ethan guided Beatrice to the edge of the wooden sidewalk and helped her ease down to sit, her back against a post. She kept her eyes on the gelding, which stood nearby with its head lowered, still shaking but no longer trying to flee. "Is that your horse?" Beatrice asked, her breathing slightly labored now that the immediate crisis had passed and the shock was beginning to set in. "His name is Copper," Ethan confirmed, crouching beside her so they were at eye level. "I have had him for 6 years now, and he has never spooked like that before. Those damned outlaws could have killed him." His jaw tightened at the thought, anger mixing with relief that his faithful mount had survived. "The bandage will hold for now, but you will need to clean the wound properly with carbolic solution and apply a proper poultice," Beatrice said, her professional tone suggesting this was not her first experience with injured animals. "Comfrey and yarrow would be best, mixed with a bit of honey to prevent infection." "You know horses," Ethan observed, impressed by her specific knowledge. He reached up and pulled his own bandana from around his neck, wadding it up and pressing it gently against her shoulder wound. Beatrice winced but did not pull away. "I grew up on a ranch outside of Cheyenne," she explained, her face pale but her voice still steady. "My father raised quarter horses, and I spent more time in the stables than I did in the house. Animals have always made more sense to me than most people." A doctor was making his way down the street now, checking on the injured townspeople. Ethan raised his voice to call the man over, but Beatrice shook her head. "There are others hurt worse than me," she protested. "I saw Mrs. Henderson take a fall when the shooting started, and old Mr. Tucker was clutching his chest." "And you have a bullet in your shoulder," Ethan countered, his tone brooking no argument. "You are going to let Doc Mayfield look at you, and that is the end of it." The doctor, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles, knelt beside Beatrice and began examining her wound with gentle efficiency. "You are lucky, miss," he pronounced after a moment. "The bullet went clean through, missed the bone and the major blood vessels. You will be sore for a good while, but you should heal up fine with proper care." Ethan felt relief wash over him with such intensity that it surprised him. He barely knew this woman, did not even know her name yet, but the thought of her being seriously injured had filled him with an anxiety he could not quite explain. "I am going to need to clean and stitch this," Doc Mayfield continued, reaching into his medical bag. "I can do it here, or we can move to my office down the street." "Here is fine," Beatrice said quickly. "I would rather not move just yet if it is all the same to you." The doctor nodded and began preparing his supplies. Ethan remained at Beatrice's side, his hand still steadying her uninjured arm, though she seemed to have regained some of her composure. He found himself studying her face, noting the delicate line of her jaw, and the way her eyes held a depth of character that spoke of someone who had lived through more than her years might suggest. She could not have been more than 25, he judged, but there was a quiet strength in her that reminded him of tempered steel. "I am Ethan Irving," he said, suddenly realizing they had not been properly introduced, despite the intimacy of their current situation. "And I owe you a debt for what you did for Copper. Not many people would have put themselves at risk like that, especially when already injured." "Beatrice Kane," she replied, offering him a slight smile despite the pain she must have been feeling. "And you owe me nothing. I would have done the same for any animal in distress." The doctor began cleaning her wound, and Beatrice's smile faded as she bit down hard on her lower lip. Ethan found himself wishing he could do something to ease her pain, to make this easier for her somehow. Without thinking, he reached for her good hand and held it, offering what comfort he could through that simple contact. "Talk to me," he said, trying to distract her from what the doctor was doing. "Tell me what brought you to Jackson. Were you just passing through, or are you planning to stay?" Beatrice gripped his hand tightly as the doctor worked, her knuckles white with the effort of staying still. "I came to work for the widow Thompson," she managed between shallow breaths. "She runs a boarding house on the edge of town and needed help with the daily work. I have only been here for 3 weeks. I know Mrs. Thompson," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm and conversational. "She makes the best apple pie in the territory. Her late husband used to sell me supplies for the ranch." "You have a ranch?" Beatrice asked, latching onto the topic as a distraction from the needle piercing her flesh. "About 15 miles north of here," Ethan confirmed. "Cattle mostly, with a few horses. It is not fancy, but it is good land with plenty of water and grass. I have been working it for 10 years now, built it up from nothing." He could hear the pride in his own voice, the satisfaction of a man who had carved out something of value through hard work and determination. The ranch was his life, his purpose, the thing that gave meaning to his days. Yet sitting here holding this woman's hand while she endured medical treatment, Ethan felt something shift inside him, some recognition that perhaps there was more to life than just land and cattle and the endless cycle of seasons. Doc Mayfield finished his stitching and wrapped Beatrice's shoulder in clean bandages, his movements efficient but not unkind. "You need to keep this clean and dry," he instructed. "Change the dressing twice a day, and if you see any signs of infection, redness, swelling, fever, you come see me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor," Beatrice agreed, her voice weaker now that the worst of the ordeal was over. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "She needs rest and probably something for the pain," Doc Mayfield said, addressing Ethan now as if assuming he had some responsibility for Beatrice's care. "Can you see her home safely?" "Of course," Ethan said without hesitation. He looked at Beatrice, noting the way she was struggling to keep her eyes open. "I will take you back to Mrs. Thompson's in my wagon. You are in no condition to walk." Beatrice started to protest, but Ethan silenced her with a gentle shake of his head. "You took care of my horse when you should have been seeing to yourself," he said quietly. "The least I can do is make sure you get home safely." She nodded reluctantly, too tired to argue further. Ethan helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way slowly to where his wagon stood in front of the general store. Copper followed behind, limping slightly but mobile, and Ethan made a mental note to tend to the horse's wound as soon as he had seen Beatrice safely delivered. The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, surrounded by a well-tended garden that showed Mrs. Thompson's love of growing things. The widow herself came rushing out as soon as she saw the wagon pull up, her round face creased with worry. "Beatrice, I heard about the shooting. Are you hurt badly?" The older woman's hands fluttered anxiously as Ethan helped Beatrice down from the wagon seat. "I will be fine, Mrs. Thompson," Beatrice assured her, though her pale face and bandaged shoulder told a different story. "The doctor says I just need rest." "Well, you will get plenty of that, Mrs. Thompson declared, taking charge with the brisk efficiency of someone used to managing difficult situations. "Mr. Irving, can you help her up to her room? It is the second door on the left at the top of the stairs." Ethan did as instructed, carefully supporting Beatrice as they climbed the stairs. Her room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt and a window that looked out over the garden. He helped her sit on the edge of the bed, and for a moment, Neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Beatrice said finally, looking up at him with those storm-gray eyes. "You have been very kind." "You saved my horse," Ethan replied simply. "That deserves more than kindness." He hesitated, aware that he was reluctant to leave but unsure what else he could do. "I should go tend to Copper's wound, but I will check on you tomorrow if that is acceptable." A faint smile touched Beatrice's lips. "I would like that," she said softly. Ethan left the boarding house with his mind full of thoughts of auburn hair and gray eyes, and a woman brave enough to ignore her own pain to help an injured animal. He had courted a few women over the years, had even come close to proposing once to a banker's daughter in Cheyenne, but nothing had ever felt like this. This strange recognition, as if he had been waiting his whole life to meet Beatrice Kane and had not even known it. Back at his ranch that evening, after he had properly cleaned and dressed Copper's wound, Ethan sat on his porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. The ranch hands had already turned in for the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He kept seeing Beatrice in the street, her focus entirely on his frightened horse, despite the blood soaking her blouse. There had been something almost holy in that moment, a kind of grace that he had not known existed outside of church paintings and poetry. He returned to Jackson the next day as promised, arriving at the boarding house just after noon with a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden and a jar of his housekeeper's famous beef broth. "Mrs. Thompson answered his knock with a knowing smile that suggested she had not missed the look in his eyes when he had brought Beatrice home yesterday. "She is in the parlor," the widow said, ushering him inside. "I made her come downstairs for a bit." She was trying to insist she should be working, if you can imagine that. Girl was shot yesterday and thinks she should be scrubbing floors today. Ethan found Beatrice sitting in an armchair by the window, a book open in her lap though she was staring out at the street rather than reading. She wore a simple blue dress with the sleeve cut to accommodate her bandaged shoulder, and her hair was neatly pinned though a few rebellious curls had escaped to frame her face. She looked up as he entered, and her expression brightened in a way that made his pulse quicken. "Mr. Irving," she said, starting to rise until he waved her back down. "Please call me Ethan," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Mr. Irving makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and discussing business in some city office." "Then you must call me Beatrice," she replied, closing her book. "Though I warn you, Mrs. Thompson has already started calling me B, and I suspect it will stick no matter what I say." They talked for over an hour, conversation flowing easily despite their short acquaintance. Ethan learned that Beatrice had left Cheyenne after her father's death 6 months ago. The ranch had been sold to pay his debts, and she had found herself alone with few prospects and fewer resources. The position with Mrs. Thompson had seemed like Providence, a chance to start fresh in a new place. "I miss the horses most," Beatrice admitted, a wistful note in her voice. "My father taught me everything he knew about breeding and training. I had planned to take over the ranch one day, but life had other ideas." "You could have married," Ethan observed carefully. "A woman with your knowledge and skills would have been valuable to any rancher looking for a wife." Beatrice's expression hardened slightly. "I had offers," she said. "Men who saw me as a convenient path to acquiring my father's land and stock. They were not interested in me, only in what I could bring them. I would rather earn my own way as a maid than be married for my inheritance." Ethan respected that fierce independence, even as part of him wanted to tell her that not all men were so mercenary. He himself had built his ranch through years of backbreaking work, had no need of anyone's land or money. What he wanted, though he barely dared admit it to himself after only 2 days, was a partner, someone to share the burdens and joys of ranch life. someone who understood the language of horses and the rhythm of seasons. Someone exactly like Beatrice Kane. He visited again 2 days later, and then 3 days after that. Each time they talked longer, discovered more shared interests and values. Beatrice's shoulder was healing well, and she had begun light work around the boarding house, despite Mrs. Thompson's protests. Ethan found excuses to come to town more frequently than his ranch duties really required, always making sure his visits coincided with times when Beatrice might be free to sit and talk. 3 weeks after the robbery, Ethan finally worked up the courage to invite Beatrice to visit his ranch. "I know it is not proper for me to ask without a chaperone," he said, aware he was probably overstepping the bounds of propriety. "But I thought you might like to see the horses. I have a mare who just had a foal, and I could use your opinion on the colt's conformation." Beatrice's eyes lit up with an eagerness that told Ethan he had struck exactly the right note. "I would love to see them," she said. "And Mrs. Thompson has mentioned she needs to visit her sister's place, which is on the way to your ranch. Perhaps she could accompany me and we could drop her there first." It was all arranged with surprising ease, and the following Saturday found Ethan driving his wagon toward the ranch with Beatrice seated beside him. They had left Mrs. Thompson at her sister's farm with promises to collect her on the return journey. And now, they were alone together for the first time since that day in the street, when Beatrice had bandaged Copper's wound. "It is beautiful out here," Beatrice said, gazing at the rolling grasslands and the mountains rising in the distance. The autumn air was crisp and clear, the aspens turning gold against the deep green of the pines. "I had forgotten how much I missed being away from town." "Wait until you see the ranch," Ethan said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "We have a creek that runs through the property, cold and clear even in the driest summers. The grazing is good, and there is timber enough for building and firewood. It took me years to get the herd up to where it is now, but I have nearly 200 head of cattle." The ranch house came into view as they crested a rise, a sturdy log structure with a wide porch and stone chimney. It was not large or fancy, but it was well built and well maintained, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of a prosperous operation. Ethan's foreman, Tom Chen, emerged from the barn as they pulled up, his weathered face breaking into a grin when he saw his employer had brought a visitor. "Tom, this is Miss Kane," Ethan said, helping Beatrice down from the wagon. "Beatrice, Tom has been with me since the beginning. He knows more about cattle than any man in Wyoming." Tom tipped his hat respectfully. "Madam, heard you were the one who tended to Copper when he got shot up in town. That was a fine thing you did." "How is he doing?" Beatrice asked immediately, her concern for the horse evident. "Healing up just fine," Tom assured her. "Boss has been babying him something fierce, checking that wound twice a day and feeding him extra grain. Horse is going to get spoiled if he keeps it up." Ethan felt his ears grow warm at this good-natured teasing, but Beatrice just laughed, a sound like water over stones that made something in his chest expand. "A good horse deserves a little spoiling," she said. "They give us so much and ask for so little in return." Tom showed them to the barn where the new foal was stabled with its mother. The colt was a leggy bay with a white star on its forehead, all awkward angles and oversized ears as it nursed contentedly. Beatrice approached slowly, speaking in that same low, soothing voice Ethan remembered from the day they met. The mare, a patient sorrel with kind eyes, allowed Beatrice to run her hands over the foal, examining its legs and body with expert precision. "He is going to be tall," Beatrice pronounced after a thorough inspection. "Good bone structure, nice straight legs. The chest is a bit narrow now, but that will fill out as he grows. Who is the sire?" "A thoroughbred stud I borrowed from the Richardson Ranch," Ethan said. "I am hoping to breed some speed into my stock while keeping the quarter-horse temperament and cow sense." They spent the next hour going through the rest of Ethan's horses, with Beatrice offering observations and suggestions that demonstrated her deep knowledge. Ethan found himself more and more impressed and more convinced that this woman was unlike anyone he had ever met. She belonged here in the barn and corrals, belonged in this life of horses and wide open spaces. His housekeeper, Mrs. Yates, had prepared a meal for them, and they ate on the porch while the afternoon sun slanted across the yard. Ethan's cattle dotted the distant hillsides, peacefully grazing, and the mountains stood eternal against the sky. It was the life Ethan had worked so hard to build, and having Beatrice here to share it, even for just an afternoon, felt more right than anything had in years. "I could live like this forever," Beatrice said softly, almost to herself. She was gazing out at the landscape with an expression of such longing that Ethan felt his heart clench. "Then stay," he said, the words tumbling out before he could think better of them. "I mean, not today, obviously, but stay in Jackson. Stop working as a maid and come work for me. I could use someone with your knowledge to help with the horses. The pay would be fair, and Mrs. Yates can serve as chaperone so everything stays proper." Beatrice turned to look at him, surprise and something else flickering in those gray eyes. "You are offering me a job." "I am offering you a chance to work with horses again," Ethan clarified. "To use the skills your father taught you. You are wasted scrubbing floors and washing linens, Beatrice. You could do so much more." For a long moment she did not respond, and Ethan worried he had pushed too far, too fast. Then a slow smile spread across her face, transforming it with joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would like that very much." They made the arrangements over the next week. Mrs. Thompson was sorry to lose Beatrice's help, but pleased to see her moving on to something better suited to her talents. Ethan converted one of the spare rooms in the ranch house for Beatrice's use, ensuring she would have privacy and comfort. Mrs. Yates, a stern woman in her 60s who had kept house for Ethan since his early days on the ranch, proved to be an excellent chaperone and quickly developed a fondness for the younger woman. Beatrice moved to the ranch on a crisp October morning, her few possessions fitting easily into 2 worn carpet bags. Ethan tried not to read too much into the way her face lit up when she stepped down from the wagon and looked around at what would now be her home. He tried not to think about the fact that he had arranged his entire life around bringing this woman into it. He tried and failed on both counts. She proved her worth within days. The horses responded to her with a trust and willingness that impressed even Tom, who had been skeptical about hiring a woman for what was traditionally men's work. Beatrice seemed to have an instinct for what each animal needed, whether it was patient gentling for a skittish colt or firm handling for a stubborn gelding testing its boundaries. She worked from dawn until dusk. Her injured shoulder finally healed enough to allow full movement, and she never complained about the long hours or hard labor. Ethan found himself making excuses to work near wherever Beatrice was, drawn to her presence like iron to a lodestone. They would talk as they worked, sharing stories about their pasts and dreams for the future. He learned about her mother, who had died when Beatrice was 12, and how she had taken over running her father's household while still helping with the horses. She learned about his years working other men's ranches before finally saving enough to buy his own land, about the lean early years when he had lived in a tent and worked 18-hour days to get the place established. "You must be proud of what you have built," Beatrice said one evening as they stood by the corral watching the sun set. They had been working together for nearly a month, and the easy partnership they had developed felt as natural as breathing. "I am," Ethan admitted. "But lately I find myself wanting more. Not more land or more cattle. Something different. Someone to share it all with." He was not looking at her as he spoke, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon, but he could feel Beatrice's attention sharpen. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. "I think I understand," she said quietly. "I spent so many years focused on just surviving after my mother died, on keeping my father's ranch running and his spirits up. I told myself I did not need anything more than the work and the horses. But being here, it has made me realize how much I was missing." Ethan turned to face her then, his heart pounding with a courage he usually reserved for breaking wild horses or facing down angry bulls. "Beatrice, I know it has only been a few months since we met. I know you probably think I am moving too fast. But I have to tell you what I am feeling, because keeping it inside is about to kill me." She met his gaze steadily, her gray eyes luminous in the fading light. "Tell me," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. "I am falling in love with you," Ethan said, the words both terrifying and liberating. "Actually, I think I have been falling since the moment I saw you bandage Copper's wound while you were bleeding and should have been taking care of yourself. Every day since then, I have fallen a little bit more. The way you talk to the horses, the way you laugh at Tom's terrible jokes, the way you look at this land like it is something precious. Everything about you makes me want things I had stopped letting myself want." Beatrice took a step closer to him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest where his heart was hammering. "What things?" she asked, though the softness in her voice suggested she already knew. "A wife," Ethan said honestly. "A family. Someone to build this ranch with, not just for. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to teach our children to ride and rope and respect the land. I want 50 years of your company, and that still would not feel like enough." "Ethan," Beatrice breathed, and there were tears shining in her eyes. "I feel the same way. I think I have since that first day when you held my hand while the doctor stitched my shoulder. You made me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I never had before. Working here with you these past weeks has been the happiest I have ever been. And it is not just the horses or the land. It is you." He kissed her then, a gentle pressing of lips that nevertheless felt like a promise and a prayer. Beatrice leaned into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and for a long moment the world narrowed to just the two of them standing in the gathering dusk with the mountains watching over them. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and grinning like fools. "I should ask you properly," Ethan said, suddenly remembering the forms and rituals that such things required. "I do not have a ring yet, but Beatrice Kane, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you." They told Mrs. Yates that evening, and the housekeeper surprised them both by pulling Beatrice into a fierce hug. "About time," she pronounced. "I have been watching you two dance around each other for weeks. Thought I might have to knock your heads together." Tom's response was equally enthusiastic when they informed him the next morning. "Boss, you finally did something smart for a change," he said, shaking Ethan's hand with genuine warmth before turning to Beatrice. "Madam, you are getting a good man, even if he does have some peculiar ideas about cattle breeding." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Jackson, with half the town turning out for the ceremony. Mrs. Thompson cried throughout the service, while Tom and the other ranch hands sat in the back pews wearing their cleanest shirts and most uncomfortable expressions. Beatrice wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Yates had helped her sew, and Ethan thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, with tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by friends and neighbors. Doc Mayfield raised a toast to the couple, noting with amusement that he had never before attended a wedding that started with him having to dig a bullet out of the bride. Everyone laughed, and Beatrice blushed prettily while Ethan squeezed her hand under the table. Their wedding night was spent at the ranch, in the bedroom Ethan had inhabited alone for so many years. He had been nervous about this part, worried that his relative inexperience would disappoint Beatrice. But she met him with an openness and trust that made everything feel natural and right. They came together with tenderness and passion, learning the language of each other's bodies, and afterward lay tangled together talking until the early hours of the morning. "I never thought I would have this," Beatrice confessed, her head resting on Ethan's chest where she could hear his heartbeat. "After my father died and I lost everything, I convinced myself that I would always be alone, that I would spend my life working for other people, never really belonging anywhere." "You belong here," Ethan said firmly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You belong with me. This ranch is as much yours now as it is mine. Everything I have, everything I am, I share with you." The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. A harsh winter tested their resources and resolve, with Ethan and his men spending long days digging cattle out of snowdrifts and hauling hay to stranded animals. Beatrice proved invaluable during those difficult months, her knowledge and work ethic never wavering even when temperatures dropped well below zero, and the wind howled across the plains like a living thing. Spring brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. Several mares foaled successfully, and Beatrice spent hours with the new colts, beginning their education with the gentle patience that was her hallmark. The cattle came through the winter in better shape than Ethan had dared hope, and by early summer it was clear that the ranch would not only survive but thrive. It was during one of those golden summer days that Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When Doc Mayfield confirmed her condition during one of his visits to check on a ranch hand's broken arm, Beatrice felt a joy so profound it almost frightened her. She told Ethan that evening as they sat on the porch after supper. He had been talking about his plans to expand the herd, but fell silent when she said his name in that particular way that meant she had something important to share. "I am with child," Beatrice said simply, watching his face for his reaction. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to the bunkhouse. He swept her up in his arms, careful of her growing belly, and spun her around while she laughed and told him to put her down before he hurt himself. "We are having a baby," Ethan said wonderingly, setting her back on her feet but keeping his hands on her waist. "You are going to be a mother and I am going to be a father. We are going to have a family. I hope you are ready for sleepless nights and dirty diapers," Beatrice teased, though her own joy was evident in her glowing face. "I am ready for everything," Ethan declared. "As long as I get to do it with you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Beatrice chafed at the restrictions Doc Mayfield placed on her activities. She was forbidden from breaking horses or any other work that might involve falling, and Ethan enforced these rules with a firmness that bordered on tyranny. They argued about it occasionally, usually ending with Beatrice accusing him of being overprotective, and Ethan responding that he would rather have her angry than injured. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1884, arriving after a labor that lasted through the night and into the dawn. Doc Mayfield and Mrs. Yates attended the birth, while Ethan paced anxiously in the kitchen until he finally heard his child's first cry. He bounded up the stairs with his heart in his throat, entering the bedroom to find Beatrice exhausted but radiant, holding a red-faced, squalling infant wrapped in blankets. "Meet your son," she said softly, and Ethan felt his eyes sting with tears as he carefully took the tiny bundle into his arms. "Hello, little one," he whispered, marveling at the perfect miniature fingers and the shock of dark hair. "I am your father, and I promise you I am going to do my best by you." They named him Edward Irving after both of Ethan's grandfathers. From the beginning, he was a sturdy baby with a good appetite and strong lungs. Beatrice took to motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else, though she admitted to Ethan in private that she found it both more exhausting and more rewarding than she had imagined. "I used to think my work with the horses was the most important thing I could do," she said one night as she nursed Emmett by lamplight while Ethan sat beside them. "But this, raising a child, shaping a life, it makes everything else seem small by comparison." "You can do both," Ethan pointed out. "Once he is a bit older, Emmett can come to the barn with us. He can grow up around the horses just like you did." And that was exactly what happened. As soon as Emmett could walk, he was toddling after his mother to the stables, his small hand clasped firmly in hers. Beatrice taught him to approach horses with respect and confidence, to read their moods and respond appropriately. By the time he was 4 years old, Emmett could sit a horse by himself, his face screwed up in concentration as he gripped the reins. The ranch continued to prosper under Ethan and Beatrice's joint management. They expanded their horse breeding operation, with Beatrice's expertise producing animals that were sought after throughout Wyoming and beyond. Ethan focused on the cattle side of things, gradually improving his herd through careful selection and crossbreeding. They hired additional help as needed, building a community of loyal workers who respected both husband and wife. When Emmett was 3 years old, Beatrice found herself pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, though the pregnancy was harder on her body than the first had been. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1887, a squalling, black-haired beauty they named Bonnie Rose. Where Emmett had been placid and easy, Bonnie proved to be a force of nature from the start, demanding attention and getting her way through sheer force of personality. "She is exactly like her mother," Ethan observed fondly when Bonnie was 6 months old and had just talked her way into an extra piece of bread at supper, despite having already eaten her fill. "I was never that manipulative," Beatrice protested, though she was smiling as she watched her daughter charm Mrs. Yates out of a cookie. "You absolutely were," Ethan countered. "You just used horses instead of words. I have seen you talk a spooked stallion down from panic." Bonnie comes by her talents honestly. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. The children grew healthy and strong, Emmett becoming his father's shadow while Bonnie seemed determined to best her older brother at everything from riding to roping. The ranch thrived, becoming one of the more successful operations in the region. Ethan and Beatrice's reputation for quality stock brought buyers from as far away as Colorado and Montana. But it was not just their professional success that defined their lives. It was the small moments, the everyday intimacies of a marriage built on genuine love and respect. It was Ethan bringing Beatrice wildflowers he found while riding fence lines. It was Beatrice leaving notes in his saddlebags for him to find when he was out with the herd. It was the way they still made time for each other, even with 2 demanding children and a ranch to run, stealing kisses in the barn and making love by lamplight after the household was asleep. "You ever regret it?" Ethan asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they tried to observe whenever possible. The children were inside with Mrs. Yates, supposedly getting ready for bed, though the sounds of laughter suggested that process was not going smoothly. "Regret what?" Beatrice asked, confused by the question. "Any of it. Staying in Jackson instead of going somewhere else. Marrying me. Living out here away from town and society." Beatrice turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Ethan Irving, I have never regretted a single moment with you. This life we have built together is more than I ever dreamed of having. You gave me back the work I love, a family, a home. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Ethan said, reaching for her hand. "That you do not feel like you settled or gave up something important." "I am happy," Beatrice assured him, squeezing his fingers. "Happier than I have any right to be, and if I have given up anything, it is only the loneliness and uncertainty I used to carry. I would call that a fair trade." As the years passed, their love did not diminish but rather deepened and matured like good whiskey. They learned each other's moods and needs, developed the kind of unspoken communication that long-married couples achieve. They weathered the inevitable conflicts and disagreements that arise in any partnership, learning to compromise and forgive. They celebrated successes and supported each other through disappointments. When Emmett turned 10, Ethan began teaching him the business side of ranching, taking him along on trips to market and explaining the economics of buying and selling. Beatrice taught him horsemanship in its finest details, from proper grooming to the subtle cues that made the difference between a good rider and a great one. The boy absorbed it all with quiet determination, clearly intent on following in his parents' footsteps. Bonnie, at 7, was already showing signs of being a talented horsewoman in her own right, though her interests ranged wider than her brother's. She wanted to know everything about everything, constantly asking questions and never satisfied with simple answers. Beatrice saw herself in her daughter's curiosity and encouraged it, even when it led to muddy dresses and scraped knees. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Beatrice with a trip to Denver. Mrs. Yates agreed to watch the children, and Tom promised to manage the ranch for a week. It was the first time since their marriage that Beatrice and Ethan had been truly alone together for more than a day, and the freedom was both strange and wonderful. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate in restaurants, and attended a concert at the Opera House. Beatrice, who had not worn a fancy dress in years, felt slightly ridiculous in her new gown, but Ethan looked at her like she was the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. On their last night in the city, they stood on the balcony of their hotel room looking out at the lights of Denver, and Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket. "I never properly gave you an engagement ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a single sapphire the color of Beatrice's eyes. "I was too eager to marry you to wait for something like this to be made. But I have been carrying this around for 3 months, waiting for the right moment." "It is beautiful," Beatrice breathed, watching as he slipped the ring onto her finger above her wedding band. "But you did not need to do this. I never cared about having a fancy ring." "I know," Ethan said. "But I wanted you to have it anyway. I wanted something that would remind you, every time you look at it, how much I love you, how grateful I am that you took a chance on a cowboy who was stupid enough to let his horse get shot." Beatrice laughed through her tears, pulling him close for a kiss. "That cowboy turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me," she said against his lips. "And I would take that chance again in a heartbeat." They returned home to find the ranch in perfect order and the children thrilled to have them back. Emmett had grown at least an inch in their absence, while Bonnie had apparently spent the week terrorizing Mrs. Yates with her endless energy and questions. Life returned to its familiar patterns, but both Ethan and Beatrice felt renewed by their time away, reminded that they were not just parents and ranchers, but also lovers and partners. As the 1890s began, changes came to Wyoming and the West. The railroad expanded its reach, making it easier to ship cattle but also bringing more settlers and changing the open range forever. Jackson grew from a small frontier town into a proper community with schools and shops and regular mail service. The children of Ethan and Beatrice's generation were growing up in a world that was becoming more civilized and less wild with each passing year. "Sometimes I miss the old days," Tom said one evening as he sat with Ethan on the porch. The foreman was in his 60s now, his hair gone gray and his joints stiff in the mornings. When it was all open country and a man's word was his bond. These days, everything is contracts and regulations. "Change comes whether we want it or not," Ethan replied, though he understood what Tom meant. He had seen the West transform during his lifetime, had watched as the rough edges were slowly smoothed away. "The best we can do is adapt and make sure we do not lose the good parts in the process." "You and Miss Beatrice have done that," Tom observed. "Built something that honors the old ways while being smart about the new. Your kids are learning both." It was true. Emmett, now a gangly teenager, could ride and rope with the best of the ranch hands, but he also studied mathematics and history from the books his mother ordered from back east. Bonnie, 12 years old and fearless, spent her mornings working horses and her afternoons reading everything she could get her hands on. Both children understood that the world was changing and they would need to change with it, but neither had lost the essential connection to the land and animals that defined ranch life. When Emmett was 16 and Bonnie 13, Beatrice found herself unexpectedly pregnant again. She was 39 years old now, and Doc Mayfield expressed concern about the risks of childbirth at her age. But Beatrice was healthy and strong, and while Ethan worried, he trusted his wife's instincts. Their third child, a boy they named Benjamin Thomas Irving after Tom, who had become like family, arrived in the spring of 1896 without complications. He was a small baby, more delicate than his siblings had been, but he thrived under his mother's care and his siblings' doting attention. Emmett, nearly grown, took his role as big brother seriously, while Bonnie treated the baby like a living doll and had to be reminded to be gentle. "I think we are done now," Beatrice said firmly one night after spending an hour walking a fussy Benjamin around the bedroom. "I love this little one dearly, but I am too old for sleepless nights and constant nursing." "Agreed," Ethan said, taking the now sleeping baby from her and placing him carefully in his cradle. 3 healthy children are more blessing than most people get. We should count ourselves lucky and not push our fortune. As Benjamin grew, it became clear that he had inherited his mother's gift with animals. Even as a toddler, he would sit contentedly for hours watching the horses, and by the time he was 4, he could identify each animal by name and temperament. Beatrice delighted in teaching him, seeing in her youngest child a reflection of her own childhood passion. The turn of the century brought both celebration and reflection. On the last day of 1899, the entire family gathered in the ranch house kitchen to welcome the new year. Emmett, now a young man of 18 helping to run the ranch alongside his father, raised a glass of cider and toast. Bonnie, 16 and beautiful with her mother's storm-gray eyes, sat beside him. Benjamin, just 4 years old, perched on Beatrice's lap, watching the adults with solemn curiosity. "To the 20th century," Emmett declared. "May it bring as much happiness as the old one did to this family." "To family," Ethan echoed, meeting Beatrice's eyes across the table. To the best decision I ever made, which was convincing Beatrice Kane to marry a rancher she barely knew. You did not have to convince me, Beatrice reminded him with a smile. I knew from the start that you were something special. Any man who would stand in the middle of a gunfight to recover his injured horse was worth taking a chance on. I was not in the middle of the gunfight, Ethan protested. I was behind a water trough being sensible. You came out to check on Copper while bullets were still flying, Beatrice countered. That was brave, even if it was also foolish. It brought me you, Ethan said simply, so I would do it again in a heartbeat. The children groaned good-naturedly at their parents' obvious affection. But both Emmett and Bonnie had grown up seeing the evidence of a strong, loving marriage, and it had shaped their own expectations for their futures. Emmett had already mentioned a girl in town he was courting, the daughter of the mercantile owner, while Bonnie declared regularly that she had no interest in marriage and planned to run the ranch with her brothers when the time came. As the new century unfolded, the ranch continued to prosper. Emmett married his sweetheart in 1902 and brought her to live at the ranch, where she and Beatrice developed an easy friendship. A year later, they welcomed the first grandchild, a girl named Eliza who immediately became the center of attention for the entire family. Ethan, now a grandfather at 52, found himself marveling at how quickly time had passed. I remember when you were that small, he said to Emmett one evening, watching his son cradle baby Eliza with practiced ease. Seems like just yesterday. I remember you telling me that time moves faster as you get older, Emmett replied. I did not believe you then, but I am starting to understand now. Bonnie, true to her word, showed no interest in leaving the ranch. At 19, she was one of the finest horsewomen in Wyoming, and buyers came from across the territory specifically to purchase animals she had trained. She worked alongside her mother and brothers, managing the breeding program and developing new training techniques that enhanced the reputation of Irving ranch horses. Benjamin, at 9 years old, was already showing signs of becoming a skilled horseman himself. He had none of Emmett's business sense, or Bonnie's fierce independence, but he possessed a quiet confidence around animals that reminded everyone of his mother. Beatrice spent long hours with him, passing on the knowledge her own father had given her, ensuring that the tradition would continue through another generation. On a warm summer evening in 1905, Ethan and Beatrice sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray, and their faces lined by years of sun and wind and laughter. The ranch house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, but this porch remained unchanged, still their favorite place to watch the sunset and reflect on the day. We have built a good life here, Ethan said, his hand finding Beatrice's as naturally as breathing. Better than I ever dreamed possible. We have been lucky, Beatrice agreed. Blessed with good health, good children, good land. Not everyone gets that. It was not just luck, Ethan insisted. It was you, your knowledge and your work ethic and your refusal to give up even when things were hard. You made this place what it is. We made it together, Beatrice corrected gently. Everything we have, we built as partners. I could not have done any of this without you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Emmett walked across the yard with Eliza perched on his shoulders. Bonnie emerged from the barn, laughing at something Tom had said. Benjamin was playing with the ranch dogs, his high voice carrying across the evening air. Inside the house, Emmett's wife Sarah was helping Mrs. Yates prepare supper, their voices a pleasant murmur through the open windows. Do you remember that day we met? Ethan asked suddenly. When the bank was robbed and Copper got shot. Of course, Beatrice said. How could I forget? You thought I was crazy for tending to a horse when I had a bullet in my shoulder." "I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met," Ethan corrected. "I still do. You could have walked away, could have saved yourself and let Copper panic or run off. But you did not. You saw an animal in pain and you helped him, even though it cost you." "It did not cost me anything," Beatrice said softly. "It brought me you. It brought me all of this." She gestured at the ranch, at their children and grandchild, at the life they had built together. "If anything, that bullet was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Even so," Ethan said, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. "I have spent 23 years trying to be worthy of what you did that day, trying to be the kind of man who deserves a woman like you." "You were always worthy," Beatrice told him, her eyes shining. "From the very first moment, you were everything I needed. You gave me back my purpose, my home, my heart. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself, and you have never stopped loving me through all these years. That is more than most people ever find in a lifetime." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ethan and Beatrice remained on the porch, hands clasped, watching their family go about the evening routines. The ranch would continue to grow and change. New generations would come to work this land and love these horses, but the foundation they had built together would endure. Their story had begun with blood and bullets, with a woman brave enough to ignore her own pain to help an injured animal, and a man who recognized in that moment something extraordinary. It had unfolded through seasons of joy and hardship, through the raising of children and the building of a legacy. It had been shaped by mutual respect and shared passion, by late-night conversations and early morning coffee, by arguments resolved and victories celebrated together. Now, in the quiet of a summer evening, with the evidence of their life together spread out before them, Ethan and Beatrice Irving could look back with satisfaction and forward with hope. They had lived fully and loved deeply, had created something that would outlast them both. And it had all started because a woman had bandaged a horse before her own wounds, and a cowboy had watched and fallen hopelessly in love. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons turning and children growing. Emmett and Sarah welcomed 2 more children, a boy and another girl, expanding the family and bringing new energy to the ranch. Bonnie eventually surprised everyone by falling in love with a horse trainer from Montana who came to see the Irving ranch operation. They married when she was 24, and he moved to Wyoming to work alongside her, the two of them managing the breeding program together with obvious skill and mutual respect. Benjamin grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man who combined his mother's intuition with his father's steady reliability. At 18, he took over much of the day-to-day horse training, freeing Beatrice to focus on breeding decisions and long-term planning. He never married, content with his work and his family, becoming the anchor that held the ranch together as his older siblings eventually established their own households nearby. Tom Chen passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1908 at the age of 76, having worked for Ethan for nearly 30 years. His funeral brought together the entire community, testament to the respect he had earned through his honesty and hard work. Ethan and Beatrice mourned him deeply, having long since considered him family rather than merely an employee. Mrs. Yates followed 2 years later, and Beatrice found herself taking over the household management in addition to her work with the horses. Sarah helped when she could, but with 3 children of her own to manage, her time was limited. Beatrice discovered she did not mind the additional responsibility. There was something satisfying about keeping the house where she and Ethan had built their life together, about cooking meals in the same kitchen where she had nursed her babies, and taught her children their letters. As Ethan and Beatrice entered their 60s, they began gradually handing over more responsibilities to their children. Emmett took charge of the cattle operation entirely, while Bonnie and her husband managed the horses with Benjamin's assistance. The elder Irvings found themselves with more leisure time than they had experienced in decades, and they used it to travel occasionally, visiting relatives back east, and seeing parts of the country they had never had time to explore. But they always returned to the ranch, to the land they had worked and the home they had built. It was where they belonged, where their history was written in every fence post and barn board, in every tree they had planted and every foal they had helped birth. The mountains still rose eternal in the distance, the creek still ran cold and clear through the property, and the grass still grew green each spring. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends and neighbors from across the county. The ranch house overflowed with people and laughter, with grandchildren running underfoot, and great-grandchildren. Emmett's oldest daughter had married young, being passed from arm to arm. A local newspaperman even came to interview Ethan and Beatrice, wanting to write a story about one of the most successful ranching operations in Wyoming. "What is the secret to 40 years of marriage?" the reporter asked, his pencil poised over his notepad. Ethan and Beatrice looked at each other, a lifetime of shared experiences passing between them in a single glance. "Respect," Beatrice said finally. "We have always respected each other's skills and opinions, even when we disagreed." "Partnership," Ethan added. "We built this ranch together, raised our children together, faced every challenge together. Neither of us could have done it alone." "And love," Beatrice concluded, reaching for Ethan's hand. "The kind of love that grows deeper with time, that survives hardship and celebrates joy. The kind that says, 'I would choose you again, every single day, for the rest of my life.'" The reporter scribbled frantically, clearly pleased with these answers. But after he left and the guests dispersed, and the grandchildren were settled for the night, Ethan and Beatrice found themselves alone once more on their porch, the familiar view spread before them in the light of a full moon. 40 years, Ethan mused, shaking his head in wonder. "Seems both like forever and like no time at all." "I know what you mean," Beatrice said, leaning her head on his shoulder. They were both feeling their age now, joints stiff and energy not what it once was, but their love had only strengthened with the passage of time. "Sometimes I still see us as we were that first day. You so worried about copper, me too stubborn to admit how much pain I was in." "You saved my horse," Ethan said, as he had said countless times over the decades. "You had been shot and you saved my horse." "And you fell in love with me for it," Beatrice replied, finishing the familiar exchange. "Best decision I ever made, tending to that horse. Well, second best. The first was agreeing to marry you." They sat together in the moonlight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting from that chance meeting. Their children were settled and successful, their grandchildren healthy and happy. The ranch would continue for generations, a testament to their hard work and vision. But more than any material success, Ethan and Beatrice had the kind of love that people wrote stories about. The kind that inspired their children and gave hope to young couples just starting out. The kind that proved true partnership was possible, that two people could work together and love together and build something greater than either could achieve alone. As they finally rose to go inside, Ethan paused to look back at the land one more time. Somewhere out in the pasture, horses moved in the darkness, their presence felt if not seen. The barn stood solid and strong, sheltering the animals they had spent their lives breeding and training. The house behind them held sleeping grandchildren and memories of decades of family life. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, though he was not entirely sure what he was thanking. Fate, perhaps, or Providence, or whatever force had brought him to Jackson on that September day in 1882. Whatever had put Beatrice Kane in the right place at the right time to save his horse and capture his heart. "For what?" Beatrice asked, though her smile suggested she knew. "For all of it," Ethan said simply. "For every day, every moment, every joy and every challenge, for choosing me and for letting me choose you, for this life we have lived together." "The pleasure has been all mine," Beatrice assured him, rising on her toes to kiss his weathered cheek. "Now come inside, old man. It is past our bedtime and we have grandchildren to spoil in the morning." They went inside together, closing the door on another day in a life full of days, each one a gift, each one cherished. And if sometimes in the night, Ethan woke and watched his wife sleeping beside him, marveling that he got to spend his life with this remarkable woman, well, that was a secret he kept close to his heart. Just as Beatrice kept her own secret that she sometimes woke to find Ethan watching her, and felt a surge of gratitude so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. They had been young once, full of dreams and uncertainty. They had become partners, lovers, parents, and grandparents. They had built an empire of grass and horses and cattle, had raised children who would carry on their work. But the greatest thing they had built was each other, shaping and supporting and loving until two separate people became something greater together than they ever could have been apart. And it had all begun with a simple act of compassion, a woman who put a horse's need above her own pain, and a man who recognized in that moment the woman he wanted to spend his life loving. Everything else, the ranch, the children, the decades of partnership had grown from that seed. A single moment of grace in a chaotic, violent world that had bloomed into a lifetime of love. As dawn broke over the Irving ranch on another Wyoming morning, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Ethan and Beatrice woke together as they had for 40 years. Their hair was gray now, their faces lined, their bodies bearing the marks of age and hard work. But their eyes, when they looked at each other, still held the same light, the same recognition of having found something precious and rare. "Good morning," Beatrice murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. "Good morning, my love," Ethan replied, pulling her close for a moment before the demands of the day called them from their bed. Outside, the ranch was waking too. Horses whinnied for their breakfast, cattle lowed in the distance. Roosters crowed their morning greetings. Grandchildren would soon come tumbling out of their rooms demanding food and attention. Emmett would arrive to discuss the day's work. Bonnie would have questions about the breeding schedule. Benjamin would need help with a particularly difficult young horse. But for now, for just this moment, it was only Ethan and Beatrice, two people who had built a world together. Two people who had taken the chaos and violence of one September day and transformed it into decades of love and partnership and family. Two people who had proven that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments. "I love you," Ethan said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them, standing by a corral at sunset all those years ago. "I love you too," Beatrice replied, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Always have, always will." And with that, they rose to face another day on the ranch they had built together, in the life they had made, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges might come, they would face them side by side, just as they always had, just as they always would, for whatever time remained to them. The story of Ethan and Beatrice Irving became something of a legend in Wyoming ranching circles. People spoke of the woman who had bandaged a horse before her own wounds, and the cowboy who had fallen hopelessly in love with her in that moment. They spoke of the partnership that had built one of the most successful ranches in the territory, of the horses that bore the Irving brand and were known across the West for their quality and temperament. But more than the business success, people spoke of the love between Ethan and Beatrice. The way they still held hands after decades of marriage. The way they worked together with an understanding that needed no words. The way they looked at each other across a crowded room and smiled, sharing some private joke or memory that belonged only to them. Young couples came to the ranch hoping to learn the secret of such a successful marriage, and Ethan and Beatrice always gave the same answer. Respect each other, work together, never stop choosing each other every single day. It sounded simple, but they knew from experience that it required constant effort, constant attention, constant willingness to put the relationship first. As they entered their 70s, age began to slow them down in ways that even their strong constitutions could not entirely overcome. Ethan's joints grew stiff with arthritis, and he could no longer ride from dawn to dusk as he once had. Beatrice's eyesight dimmed, making the fine detail work of breeding decisions more challenging. But they adapted, finding new ways to contribute, trusting their children to carry on the physical work while they provided guidance and experience. They spent more time on the porch now, watching the ranch continue without their constant oversight. It was strange at first, letting go of the reins they had held so tightly for so many years. But there was also something deeply satisfying about seeing their children and grandchildren manage the operation successfully, proving that what they had built would endure beyond their own lifetimes. "We did good," Ethan said one evening, his words becoming fewer as age advanced but no less meaningful for their scarcity. "We did," Beatrice agreed, her hand clasped in his as always. "We really did." Ethan Irving passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1929, at the age of 79. He had spent his last day doing what he loved, watching the horses, talking with his grandchildren, sitting on the porch with Beatrice as the sun set over the mountains. He went to bed that night and simply did not wake, slipping away so gently that Beatrice did not realize he was gone until she reached for him in the morning. The funeral was the largest Jackson had ever seen, with people coming from across Wyoming and beyond to pay their respects to a man who had exemplified the best of Western values: hard work, integrity, loyalty, and love of the land. But for Beatrice, the loss was nearly unbearable. 46 years of marriage, of partnership, of constant companionship, and suddenly she was alone. Her children rallied around her, offering comfort and support. Emmett moved back into the main house to keep her company. Bonnie came by daily, often bringing her own grandchildren to distract and delight their great-grandmother. Benjamin, who had never left the ranch, became Beatrice's constant companion, helping her with the daily tasks that were becoming more difficult with each passing year. But nothing could fill the Ethan-shaped hole in Beatrice's heart. She had lost her partner, her best friend, the man who had loved her unconditionally for nearly half a century. She continued to live, continued to work with the horses as much as she was able, continued to take interest in her family and the ranch. But part of her was simply waiting, counting the days until she could be reunited with the man who had made her life complete. That reunion came sooner than anyone expected. Less than 6 months after Ethan's death, Beatrice suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. She lingered for a few weeks, surrounded by family, but it was clear she was ready to go. The morning she died, with all her children and several grandchildren gathered around her bed, her last words were a whisper that only Benjamin, leaning close, could hear. "I am coming, Ethan. Wait for me." She was buried beside her husband on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the eternal mountains and the endless Wyoming sky. The stone marking their graves bore simple inscriptions: their names, the dates of their births and deaths, and a single line that summed up their entire life together: partners in life, in love, in legacy. The Irving Ranch continued to prosper under the management of their children and grandchildren, the breeding program producing horses that carried the family's reputation forward into new generations. The main house remained standing, lovingly maintained, its walls holding the echoes of laughter and love and life well lived. And on the porch where Ethan and Beatrice had spent so many evenings watching the sunset, their descendants continued the tradition, sitting together in the twilight and remembering the love story that had started it all. A woman who bandaged a horse before her own wounds. A cowboy who watched and fell hopelessly in love. Two people who took that moment and built a lifetime of partnership and devotion. It was a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth aspiring to. It was the kind of love that changed lives and built legacies, and proved that sometimes the most extraordinary things can come from a single moment of grace in an ordinary day. And in Jackson, Wyoming, where it all began, people still tell the story of Ethan and Beatrice Irving. Of how they met during a bank robbery, how she cared for his horse despite her own injury, how he knew in that instant that he had found the woman he would love for the rest of his life. They tell it as a reminder that true love exists, that partnership is possible, that two people can build something beautiful and lasting if they are willing to work for it. The story lives on, passed down through generations of the Irving family and beyond. It lives on in the horses that still bear the family brand, in the ranch that continues to thrive, in the values of hard work and integrity and mutual respect that Ethan and Beatrice exemplified. But most of all, it lives on in the hearts of those who believe that love, real, deep, enduring love, is not just possible but worth striving for. Because in the end, that is what Ethan and Beatrice Irving proved. That love is not just a moment of passion or a brief spark of attraction. It is a choice made every day, a commitment renewed with each sunrise. It is work and compromise and forgiveness. It is respect and partnership and shared dreams. It is building something together that is greater than what either person could achieve alone. And it can all start with a single act of compassion, witnessed by the right person at the right time. A woman bandaging a horse before her own wounds, a cowboy watching and falling hopelessly, irrevocably, eternally in love. Their story ended, as all stories must, but what they built together endures. In the land they tended, in the children they raised, in the legacy they created. In the proof that love, true love, can transform ordinary lives into something extraordinary. That two people, meeting by chance in a moment of chaos, can choose each other and keep choosing each other until death itself cannot separate what they have built together. The Irving Ranch stands still, a testament to their vision and their labor. The horses still run in the pastures, carrying the bloodlines Beatrice so carefully cultivated. The mountains still rise eternal, watching over the land as they watched over Ethan and Beatrice throughout their lives together. And somewhere, in the realm beyond mortal understanding, two souls are reunited, their partnership extending beyond the boundaries of life itself. This is the story of Ethan and Beatrice Irving, of a love that began in blood and bullets and grew into something beautiful and lasting. Of two people who found each other against all odds and refused to let anything tear them apart. Of a legacy built on love, sustained by partnership, and remembered with reverence by all who knew them. It is a story worth telling, a story worth remembering. A story that proves that love, when nurtured and protected and chosen every single day, can create miracles. And it all started with a woman brave enough to bandage a horse before her own wounds, and a cowboy wise enough to recognize that bravery as the rarest and most precious of gifts. Everything else, the ranch, the children, the decades of happiness, flowed from that single moment of recognition. From Ethan seeing in Beatrice the partner he had been searching for all his life. From Beatrice finding in Ethan a man who valued her not for what she could bring him, but for who she was in her deepest self. They lived fully. They loved deeply. They built something that would outlast them both. And in doing so, they created a story that will echo through the generations, inspiring others to seek the same kind of partnership, the same depth of commitment, the same willingness to choose love every single day. This is the legacy of Ethan and Beatrice Irving. Not just the ranch or the horses or the material success, but the proof that true love exists, that it can endure, that it can transform two ordinary people into something extraordinary, that it can take a moment of chaos and violence and turn it into the foundation for a lifetime of happiness. They are gone now, both of them, reunited in whatever lies beyond this life. But their story remains, carved into the land they loved and the hearts of the family they created. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them. When we choose compassion over self-interest, when we open our hearts to possibility, when we recognize in another person the reflection of our own deepest hopes and dreams. A woman bandaged a horse before her own wounds. A cowboy watched and fell hopelessly in love. And from that single moment grew a love story for the ages, a partnership that built an empire, a legacy that will endure as long as the mountains stand watch over Wyoming's endless sky.